I'll briefly introduce about the interlocutor today, Jayaraj, and then hand it over. So Jayaraj is a comparative urbanist based at University College London as a fellow at Bartlett Planning Unit. His research examines the interactive spaces and practices of urban activism, planning and governance in the management of urban commons. He has written about urban commons, politics of planning practice, violations and illegalities, ecological transformation and urban politics, planning, participation, urban activism and communal geographies. His primary research field sites are cities in India are London, the field sites are cities in India and London in the UK. Apart from his academic pursuits, he has worked with local governments in London as a consultant on planning, economic generation and urban design policy, and also was a founder director of architecture and planning consultancy named Sea Earth, based in Kerala in between 2001 to 4. He has started the UCL, LSE, IIHS and NITC. He holds Masters in Urban Design from CEPT, Ahmedabad, MSc in City Design from LSE, and a PhD in Regional Urban Planning Studies from LSE in Geography. Over to you.
Thank you, Pratik.
Thanks.
So it's a real privilege to introduce this book. This is the book. Thank Amrita Shah for coming and agreeing to discuss with us. Thanks, Pradeep, for asking me to have a conversation. So Amrita Shah is a journalist, social theorist and writer, well known for her pioneering investigations into Mumbai underworld. She has worked for the Time magazine, edited features magazines in Debonair and Elle, and has been a contributing editor with the Indian Express. She is the author of Hype, Hypocrisy and Television in Urban India, Vikas 1997 publication, and Vikram Sarabhai, A Life, with Pen, Queen and Viking in 2007. She has received fellowships from the New India Foundation, the Homi Bhabha Fellowship Council, the Fulbright Foundation and the Indian Ministry of Culture. At present, she is a visiting faculty at the Center for Contemporary Studies, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Her most recent book is Ahmedabad, A City in the World, 2015, Bloomsbury publication. This is what it is. I would recommend you to buy it. It's an amazing book, and it's a great privilege for me to have a conversation about this. I thought it's an interesting juncture between urban studies, history and journalism. And that book really keep that location in this continuous conversation. So the format of the evening, first of all, thanks for coming, all of you. Format of the evening we thought is, I'll kind of have a conversation, ask questions about some thoughts I had while reading the book and about the writing, so we can respond. And after maybe 30-45 minutes, and then we'll have enough time from the audience to expand, interrogate. Yeah? So like first usual question is your motivation.
Right.
I mean, I personally have lived in Ahmedabad as a CEP student, and other than studying, hanging out there from 97 to 2001, about 4 years. And many of the characters that you discuss in the book, places that you discuss in the book, have been very familiar but have come in a new way in my life after 2002. So I was just wondering if you can explain to us or describe to us a little bit about your motivation on writing on Ahmedabad and your experience.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you Pradeep, and thank you for having this conversation and the invitation. I'm not from Ahmedabad, so first of all I need to say that because people assume I am. I am not, I am actually from Mumbai, but I happened to spend some time in Ahmedabad in the early 2000s, not live there, but I went very frequently. I was researching a book on Vikram Sarabhai, the space scientist who was born there and had a house there, and many of his institutions were there. So I happened to be traveling there frequently in the early 2000s, and this was a time when the 2002 violence, the post-Godhra violence had occurred. And since I was not, I'm a journalist, so the tendency would be to do the story of the moment. But since I was not doing that, and but I was there, I happened to see things around the main story, so to speak. So I sort of saw the way people were responding to the violence there, which was, there was a lot of, amongst the majority community, there was a kind of either a blindness, as if nothing much happened, or they said, it was either justifying the violence or there was a sort of idea that nothing much had happened, and the media outside of Ahmedabad, outside Gujarat, was making a big to-do about it. So I think my peculiar positioning of being an outsider and an insider at that point. I speak Gujarati, by then I knew people, so I knew my way around, allowed me to see things in a different way, and that's what I feel sort of started the idea of the book. So one, I started thinking about why did Ahmedabad is very much prone to communal violence. I had actually gone in 1985 for the first time as a journalist to cover an episode of communal and caste violence. So first of all, my question was, why is this place so prone to violence, to communal violence in particular? That was one question, and it wasn't being answered by, there was so much writing, but it wasn't being answered. So that was one question that came up. The other thing I noticed was that around 2004, 5, every time I kept going, Ahmedabad kept changing. So every time I went, there were these multiplexes, there were highways, there were roads, new roads, and it was bewildering because Ahmedabad is a pretty modest sized city. It's a small, not small, but you know, you can get around it easily, and there's it has a certain modest culture about it. And suddenly it was sort of, you know, you saw tall buildings, you saw hotels coming up, and before it was happening elsewhere. So all this development that was happening, and on the other side there was this sort of social divide, such a stark social divide, and the two come, you know, side by side, made me feel kind of something, I don't know what I would call it, maybe an unease, maybe that something glossy was happening over something that had not been resolved. And I wanted to, partly the impulse was sociological. I wanted to explain, or perhaps try and understand myself, what made this place so prone to violence. That was one. Partly, as I said, I guess as a journalist, I wanted to, you know, I know how to explore things in a certain way. But the third was literary. I think I wanted to kind of articulate this unease. I wanted to make sense of it. And I guess I wanted to do it in a sort of historical perspective as well. So these were all the various motivations that, you know, and then as of course I started going about and interviewing it, the form actually came much later, but somehow instinctively I think I knew what to do, I knew where to go, I don't know, there was some sort of hunch, and I work like that as a journalist as well, so I kind of found the pathways to the people I wanted to meet, to the places I wanted to go.
Okay.
But it was a mixed, you know, there were many motivations. And
right. And it's interesting that, you know, the snippets of the history that you bring into the book, other than the contemporary history, talks about how this is a great city, how this is very important in international trade, in the, you know, Akbar coming there. And there is a whole, so Ahmedabad was something important at some point in time in this whole subcontinent. And then suddenly, post 60s, it kind of was not anymore. And then it sounds now, when you read this, sounds Ahmedabad is rising again. Ahmedabad is rising again. The projects in Ahmedabad, the whole country have heard about. Suddenly, politicians in Ahmedabad, the whole country has heard about. And so there is this whole rising Ahmedabad. You start talking, you open it with this, it used to be pollution, but not anymore.
right.
No, that sentence. And then there is this whole decline. Of a decline of communal relations, increasing fear, increasing ghettoization, increasing displacement. These two images kind of go side by side on your book. Do you like to comment on that particular? Is this becoming this quintessential city of developmental India?
Yeah, I think, you know, what I wanted to, as I said, there was a hunch as well when I was seeing the development and the social divides. Yeah, I mean, I also felt, again, as I said, this outsider-insider positioning, I also felt that what was going on here was going to be significant for the country. I mean, I felt that very strongly in 2005 or so. And so the book, I mean, though it uses Ahmedabad as a framework, and very, very much so, you know, I use the physical form of the city and the people and everything. But it is really also a book about how Ahmedabad foretells India. And you know, it's not the first time this has been said. Howard Spodek, who's a historian who's written a book about Ahmedabad in the 20th century, I think, he calls it a shock city, where you can actually predict what's going to happen to India by looking at Ahmedabad. So this is one formulation which I don't necessarily go along with what he's saying, but I think what he is onto something there, that when you can actually read ahead. But let me not make it so broad. I think what I found was that, we are right now in a sort of situation of hypercapitalism, where, the kind of market forces have become very central, and there's a sort of widespread acceptance that that is the policies, the policy, right or wrong, whatever, those are the policies that are to be followed. And Ahmedabad has always been a city that has, that has been very entrepreneurial. It had trade, back in time. It had, it was an entrepot. It was a, it financed. I mean, the rich of Ahmedabad financed the Mughals in their wars. So it was an important source of finance. So even when I go into the history, actually, I have focused on that. I have focused on actually power, finance, religion, and development, modernization. I have, because I feel so that in that sense, looking back, you can see how India would how would it be if we have if we shift, the kind of shift that we saw in 91, restructuring. How would the Indian experience be? I thought Ahmedabad offered an example of that. That was, it wasn't conscious, but I think I came upon that while I was then.
So in other words, you say kind of developmental India has Ahmedabad as one of its key imaginations.
As we describe development today, not perhaps, though Ahmedabad does offer in its physical form, so in the architecture, it offers, I use the Corbusier building, just a brief mention of it.
The Atma building.
Yes, because you see various stages. So you also see the Nehruvian influence, and you do see various projects of development, But yes, I mean, yes, what you're saying, that sounds correct, that it is the developmental
Interesting,
vision.
The riots, for instance, occupy a huge presence in your book, and obviously one is not able to talk about Ahmedabad anymore without engaging with it. So at some places you say that 2002 was a key moment of Ahmedabad growth. What do you mean by that?
I don't know if I would, well, I don't know if it's a key moment, but at the point
kind of
at which,
point.
Yeah, but for me, because at the point at which I entered that city, or I thought of doing the book, it was between 2002, the violence and the development. So for me, it was because there have been episodes of mass violence before, and when you go back and read about the 1969 violence, for instance, there's similar elements as 2002. Not, of course, the same, but there are glimpses of what is to come. It's there in 1985 and then through the 90s when smaller episodes of violence. So, but yes, I mean, I do see 2002 as being pretty crucial in sort of setting the stage for the developmental shift. Because what it did, in a sense, you saw certain trends that had started earlier. So for instance, post the 1985-86 violence, you saw the mixed areas, you saw Hindus and Muslims sort of separating and moving to ghettos. Hindus were moving to Hindu areas and Muslims were moving to sort of Muslim areas. And post 2002, you saw that almost kind of become complete, virtually complete, that process.
Become a divided city totally.
Yeah, but it had started before, but really post 2002, you saw not only the poor who might have moved earlier more, you saw people of all classes. So if you go to a place like Juhapura, which is a very, very large ghetto, Muslim majority, I mean Muslim dominated area, you now see all types of housing. You see middle class housing, you see housing for the rich. So it's not like earlier it was more the poor who would have moved. So yeah, so that was one. So in terms of actual physical shift, you saw something shift after 2002, right? That was, as I said, a sort of completion of a certain process. But sorry, I forgot the question.
No, I was just asking if 2002 is a hinge to this particular.
Right, but I think what it also did was that it produced a leader. I mean, Narendra Modi was the chief minister at that time, and you know, he was seen as someone, because he was then in the elections that followed, in the election rhetoric and the kind of politics that followed. He was seen as someone who stood up for the majority community, and that was kind of strongly reinforced by the messages that were out in the electioneering at that time. And so it produced this idea of someone who could I mean, who could go ahead and do things, not waver from his course. And I think in economic terms these days, people always, we've been looking for, in terms of what the middle class or the kind of expectation from the developmental vision that was again thrown up in 2014, was that a structural shift where the leader should not waver. The leader should go on doing whatever, you know, must not be shaken from his or her course. So I'm sort of suggesting that 2002 in that sense had an impact that was beyond just interfaith.
So Ahmedabad has discovered the warrior king who developed.
You could say that. I would say the same thing happened in Delhi in 1984 end,
Right.
where, I mean, the 1985, the anti-Sikh violence, and post that you had Rajiv Gandhi having this image of someone who was going to be the modernizer.
Right.
So we've had glimpses of it before.
It's interesting that, you know, the rights, one of the things that I mean, the ghettoization you talk about, I mean, usually people, you know, an urbanist, and your book is interestingly, it reads something sometimes like Invisible Cities of Calvino. You know, you're going into the details of these different housing blocks and how they look and what they mean, and, you know, all of that, and then comes. So we used to talk about three Ahmedabads, you know, the old city, the industrial east, and the posh west. Now there seem to be four cities.
Right.
The divided part of the city is something that you would come across very clearly, when you do field work there.
You know, so this divided and this three city formulation has been, I think, used quite a bit. The east and the west, and I didn't see it. It is like that. I'm not saying it's not like that. But I think I was fluid across it. Yeah. And how I saw it was actually this. I think the fourth city, then you would mean the ghetto, right? Well, there's a chapter in my book called Bombay Hotel, the second last chapter, and I mean that chapter, how I see it is, so what I'm actually doing in this book, I think, is because I'm not an academic, but I did do a lot of reading on, you know, urban studies, whatever the reading list I went through, and one of the things that is sort of seen happening a lot is that you have gentrification in one part of the city, right? And then you have the poor and those sort of lower down on the socio-economic sort of status, so even culturally lower on the ladder, being pushed to the outskirts. And I saw the same thing could be mapped in terms of even a religious community. Right, so I saw Bombay Hotel, where a lot of the victims who fled the 2002 violence came and settled, and now they're joined by others, but it's a large Muslim ghetto on the outskirts. I saw it as kind of running parallel, you know, to the gentrification that was happening. So in a sense, it's the kind of urban restructuring that is happening in other parts of the world, but this is, I guess, a particular spin on it.
Yeah. There's also communal identity dimension along with the class dimension or something.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the way you spoke about rights, for instance, or, you know, the voices that you brought from the ground, is one idea seemed to be all over, which is subjugation of the minority.
Right.
There seemed to be some satisfaction people get in subjugating the minority, and somewhere you reflect on it, saying, is this a kind of historical inferiority complex? Because, you know, rights have been, both sides have righted, both sides have initiated rights historically, when you say, so it's difficult to point out a perpetrator in historical terms. So, but there seemed to be a very strong sense of minority to be subjugated, a lesson had to be taught, discipline.
Right.
Is it, so can you tell a little bit more about that psychology of complex, and And what does the population get in having a second-class citizens in their own city?
Yeah. Right. I actually wanted to understand communal violence, in a sense, go back into history a bit, because people keep telling you it's because historical wound or all kinds of things, right? So I wanted to do it by just getting the ethos of subjugation, as you say, because that is true. That's how I felt. So historically, you see the Muslim sultans of Gujarat, for instance, and they used the classics. I mean, they married Hindu women. They subjugated the Hindu kings, right, the Hindu rulers, and made them convert. But at least up to, I think, Aurangzeb, they were not trying to convert the rest of the population. So it was a very clear power game.
Yeah.
And I see it still as a power game. So in the first chapter, actually, where I do talk about the 2002 violence in some detail, the subjugation is against women. I mean, they're trying to subjugate women in one of the places, Naroda Patya.
Yeah.
It was like, there was almost like a kind of a program to target women and subjugate the desirable woman of the Muslim community.
Yeah, you mentioned that in exactly the same words. Yeah.
And in the other place, it was I talk about the politician,
Gulbarg Society.
Gulbarg Society.
It's
Again,
interesting. These localities in Ahmedabad has become nationally known now.
Right, that's true. Yeah, you just mentioned the name and people know what you're referring to. So there it was again the subjugation, like what I use the parallel of the mafia. I used to cover the mafia, so that's kind of a thing you do, you show who's powerful. It is a power game. And when you ask what does a city get by making someone a second-class citizen, maybe it's not so well thought out, but I think in smaller ways, it's a common phenomenon in society. You want to get rich, you want to buy a bigger car than your neighbor has. You're not really thinking, I want to make him a sort of subjugate him, right? There is a need to outdo someone.
But there seems to be a lot of satisfaction in having successfully disciplined a group, isn't it?
There is. And I guess at this particular point, this is seen as the way to achieve a certain self-esteem, I'm guessing.
Interesting. So the geography of the post-divided city, that is the next idea that comes to, as architecture students, we used to see pole as urban design student. The pole was the quintessential amazing community living with its elements, architecture, spatiality and all. And suddenly when you take a sociology hat and start thinking about the pole, it's exactly a space of exclusion of whatnot. And a lot of people who are displaced in your writing says they would rather go back to a mixed neighborhood than live in a single community group, which are the people who are displaced. In fact, Muslims, most of them. That's a very interesting situation. That why does Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so two things I'll say.
They
First,
miss the vibrancy, they miss their neighbors.
I mean the Muslims, I was actually amazed because repeatedly particularly young Muslim men kept telling me, I miss the food that was served at Hindu festivals. So there's definitely a great deal of missing, and on both sides, but it's not, you kind of have to hang around there and then you hear these sort of subtler voices. But just historically, I want to say something about Ahmedabad. It was even earlier. It's not like there were no prejudices. It was like this very happy family. No, it wasn't. There was, for instance, Hindus and Muslims worked in the mills side by side, but and even the sort of lower castes, for instance, there was a great deal of discrimination. So, for instance, you would not, there was a discriminatory practice of not hiring Dalits as weavers or wherever they had to use their spittle, so there was a great deal of, but it did not explode into violence. You see, they lived together harmoniously. They might not have liked each other's practices, or they might have lived in their own, close together. But there were bridges. They worked together. There were the labor, for instance, did come together for fighting for their rights and stuff like that. So there were spaces where there was some
Interaction.
kind of interaction.
There were also deeper interactions, like economic interaction. Craft,
Yes,
for
absolutely.
instance, there's all Muslim craftsmen.
Absolutely, yeah.
Kite making.
They make the kites, yeah, absolutely. So definitely. So those, I mean, now what has happened is the effort is to kind of divide in a far, far deeper and more sort of serious way, where you can't actually then bridge that divide. Because, schooling, if everything becomes separated, then where do you kind of come together? Yeah, you asked me something else which I've forgotten. There was architecturally, did you?
No, I was asking the desire to go back and not able to go back,
so
and they miss the community. They miss the mixed communities rather than the conservative.
So what the interesting thing I found is I didn't realize while I was writing the book. I thought the first character, Miraj, who I interview, who is the Muslim boy who's been displaced from his neighborhood, and he misses it so much. I mean, and that was actually, when I interviewed him, that came through so sort of strongly that he missed the mixed neighborhood. And so I go back with him to his earlier neighborhood and meet his friends, the Hindus that he used to live with, and then I bring out this whole idea of friendship that they had, where they used to play cricket together and fly kites and whatever they used to do together, which is now of course permanently severed. And of course there's a great deal of missing on both sides. But what I didn't quite realize while I was doing this was that I actually have 3 characters who I go back to their homes with. And it was not really conscious, but there is a Hindu boy who has left the Poles and is now living in the modern part of the city. And he too misses the Poles so much that he says, I keep running back every chance I get. And I take him back too to the Poles, and he shows me his house, which is now houses a printing press, and he doesn't live there anymore. But it's like as if he loves the streets, but he is extremely communal. And in the Poles, he has taken part in the rioting in the past. He has, he has committed acts of violence, and yet he too is a displaced person. He's displaced from a way of life that was very familiar, very cozy, very comfortable for him, to a modern, apartment block, which he feels so restless in all the time. And then there's a third character who's a Dalit bureaucrat who grew up in a really, I mean, it was one of the most destitute sort of places where, and I go back with him too. And again, as I said, it wasn't conscious. It's just that he was visiting his mother. So I said, okay, take me where you were, to the place you were born in. And he has, of course, gone to a better life in Gandhinagar. I mean, he's got a bureaucrat's apartment in a nice, clean area. And where he takes me back, of course. But what was interesting was his little house, this little tiny house that he lived in, was full of these little things they had done. So they had created a little window out of the roof, which you had run a pulley and the window opened. These wonderful contrivances, So in a sense, there are displacements due to development, there are displacements due to violence, there are displacements due to a trajectory of upward mobility.
It's interesting, in Indian urban scene, we have not really been much aware of the implications of social geographies, which is this classic conflict between freedom and security.
Right, yeah.
And we have communal ghettos, social ghettos, which is like, in that context, this becomes a seriously important issue in Ahmedabad. Is definitely an important place to understand. So next question to you is like, what is the memory of 2002? How do people live with it? I mean, you do discuss that. The resounding cries. Or,
I found, so I interviewed several people, many Hindus. Actually, I had gone in 2003. 2003. I had done some interviews at that time. And I found that's what made me realize that civil society, you see, I have lived in Mumbai, and in 1993 we had an episode of large-scale violence. Shiv Sena was very much involved, and it was again very much against the minority Muslim community. And at that time, civil society came out And you know, there was a sort of huge shock, and biases ran deep there too. I mean, it's not like, you know, it was city of great harmony, but people came out so shocked and so terrified by what had happened that they got together and do what Bombayites do well, is practically try and help the victims. This did not happen in Ahmedabad. And in fact, I found people trying to sort of saying that nothing happened, you know, why are you making a big deal
There
out
is
of
silence
this?
there.
Yeah. So that was one, and that made me uncomfortable, because I think that, you know, violence does happen, and if you acknowledge it, then you can actually, well, then you can move on as a society. But if you don't acknowledge it, then there's this latent, you know, kind of violence that stays on. And there is this, you know, this incident that happened when a grave of this poet was desecrated by the rioters, and then on top of it a road came, and for a while I saw a news report which said that the cars would just go around it, you know, no one would go above, because it makes you uncomfortable when a certain act of desecration takes place. But I guess over time people forget. But I think that forgetting is not good, because you then repeat, you don't resolve anything. I think.
When there are people who maintain studied silence, there are like Morarji Bapu, or there are people who says this is good, or there are people who says it is bad, but you have to understand. You know, that was an interesting thing. The woman who said, yeah, it is bad, but you have to understand. Right?
Well, I also do think that there was a certain atmosphere built. Perhaps over time, people do feel grief, and it will, you know, it's not that, I don't think it's a permanent thing. People do feel, and there were people who kind of came out and helped. It was not, so I think that those voices, those, feelings are not gone, you know, they're there. And maybe they will manifest in some way or the other.
But that's where I was like earlier asking about the neighborhood. In your conversations, neighborhood becomes an interesting mixed space of friendship. But then the question emerges, then who were the rioters? Who were the ones who were actually angry, if not the neighborhood? So,
I know. Well, I think, you know, you can say outsiders come, but the insiders do support, right? I mean, I think something doesn't become a riot unless there is civil society isn't sort of agreeing with it, you know, to some extent. Otherwise, it's an act of killing or theft or burglary.
When you discuss this as a kind of spectacle, right? Not necessarily as an only venging of anger. Do you want to say something about what you learned about the spectacle?
Yes, I definitely. I think it was a spectacle, and I'm in the sense that I mean, when you look at other episodes of large-scale violence in other places, say Rwanda, for instance, where thousands were killed. This, in that sense, I think the aim was more to show, to create fear, to create send a message of subjugation in a sense, also to show what is possible.
Yeah, I mean the idea of the entertainment-loving, peace-loving Ahmedabadi is not something that goes easily uncritiqued in your book. There is a whole undercurrent of violence in everything. I think I mentioned it earlier in our conversation. You know, even right from the political movement, social movements, all of that, Ahmedabad has been a place of cauldron, and it's not been a place of peace, right?
Yeah.
So,
but you know,
how would you comment on that? This undercurrent of violence in that city.
There is, and that's of course what my book, I mean, the part that made me uneasy, and that's what I write about. But I think, I mean, and I think it's also, and because of the dynamism, it's a place of great dynamism. It's a place where, for instance, after the textile mills shut down in the 70s and the 80s, you had 1/4 of the city, whatever, virtually without employment. You know, but they managed. I mean, they find work, and somehow, and I'm not saying it's without a cost or without any psychological or emotional cost, but the fact is they move on. They will find things to do. The city went into a great decline in the 80s. And again, it moved on, it created its sort of new businesses, and I think that and the violence are connected in a sense. So I'll give you an example from the past, which I found interestingly sort of explains this. So, you know, the Sabarmati is a river that flows through the city. I mean, the city was built on the banks of the Sabarmati. And it's a kind of dry river, or very variable river. It sort of floods sometimes and then it's completely dry at other times. So you navigate it. It's, you know. But there was a proposal, I think, I don't know, maybe in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They wanted to expand, make it all the way to the Gulf of Cambay, you know. And that was very much the kind of entrepreneurial thing an Ahmedabadi would think about. Environment be damned. I mean, they wanted also to explore to Muslims and the to the Hindu fold, but on the other hand, these projects have not been very good for them, you know, to some extent.
Interesting. The you know, the post-riot geography, but broadly the ghettoization, I think it's a serious thing. I mean, earlier we were discussing this, that the housing policy, that the housing cooperatives, you know, resulted into the single caste housing units, which are large number of acres housing. Do you think that has some connection in a group living?
I'm not quite sure how to think. Mumbai, yes, you know, it has resulted in that. And you also had clubs. You had the on the hand. What's actually allowed this? They sort of uphold that, right? So I'm not quite Indian, and I need to live with people who share my food habits. So one can understand, you know, so heavily Jain dominated. I mean, even the Pizza Hut that was started there had to not serve the labor mills, and so I went to municipal context and moved. I mean, it's like an SEZ,
promotion hub,
kind of big complex that's come up, and he's so envious. You know, he's part admiring, because he says this is what Narendra Modi is doing for the city, but he's not part of it anymore. You know, so there's this, but he's still full of. But that feeling, I wanted to capture that sense of being ousted from this upward mobility. But the city is still going ahead, and you're on the outskirts. But of course, he recovers himself eventually, and he's now much lower down the ladder, the economic ladder, but he's still trying. He's not given up. Yeah.
It's interesting. It brings it to the imagination, right? Like Ahmedabad, the development projects are famous in the country. Gift City, the riverfront redevelopment, Ring Road. I mean, these are key flag post projects of this phase. But like, how would you see? I mean, you do discuss all of that, and the actors in it. You discuss Bimal Patel and concrete, or Surendra Patel and Kaka, right?
Yeah.
And the negotiation. Is there a huge resurge or upsurge of developmentalism in Ahmedabad now? Would you say that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. There was a whole slew of projects that have been, as I said, you know, 2005, you could actually sort of see things happening really rapidly. So this 76-kilometer ring road that's built, and you know, just think about it. You built this sort of huge ring road without any problems. You just build it. No one protests, no one objects. So there's something to the speed with which it was sort of all done. Land was acquired. This road just came up. And then there's River 100, which is sort of to develop the banks of the Sabarmati, 11.5 kilometers on both sides, and to build highways alongside the river. So I mean, and then of course alongside it come up the malls and the you know, multiplexes and the highways and the roads, and yes, all of this, hotels come up.
Crazy capitalism going on. on, is it?
Yeah, and run away, you know, I mean, so I went back to Ahmedabad a month ago, and it's just indescribably different. Of course, the BRT.
I never saw Robert Moses, and he gave you a book on Albert Speer.
Yes.
It is very strange, I thought, that whole exchange.
Yes.
But in another way, there is also Ahmedabad has always been international. I mean, the elites were international.
Right.
John Cage performed 96. I can't believe that happened.
Yeah.
And there is Corbusier, Khan. There is a whole American
Absolutely.
group there. Maybe it is. That's why I was suggesting earlier. Like it used to be this place which were part of the world.
Yeah.
And it lost in a few years. Now it has now come back, and your book's title is also like a city in the world.
Absolutely. No, there's the parallel of the elite being so sort of, I mean, the kind of modern aspects of cultural modernity that one saw in Ahmedabad were kind of amazing. You know, the artists and the performers who came down there, Merce Cunningham dancing. I mean, you know, strange things happening in the 60s. But there was a difference. So I do have a little passage where I talk about the elites being and what they did. You know, someone went shopping for high heels to Scotland or to London. They used to sell goods to Tiffany's. You know, really. So
the rich
elite,
were really rich. Yeah.
Yeah, the elite of that time. They were an interesting elite because they were very rich, but they were also interesting. They were culturally very, very, you know, avant-garde and
there was also this trusteeship that gives something back to society,
absolutely.
build institutions.
Yeah, so they built institutions, they built charitable, you know, they established hospitals and schools and stuff like that, but they were always, it was always, well, not the cultural modernity so much, but their projects, their educational projects were always associated with the business potential. Because they saw that there was going to come a time when they were going to need clerks and secretaries and stuff like that. So they started all these educational institutions. So there was
a functional aspect of it.
Yes. But today, the modernity you see, in a sense, is a mass modernity, right? It's not that sort of very evolved aesthetic modernity. So that I think that element of aesthetic has perhaps not been questioned at all. Yeah, so when you have Bimal Patel, for instance, arguing, and you know, to be fair, it's his point of view, that you need to have a city that's so large to support so many people, you need concrete. Now, it's his argument.
I used to be part of a workshop with Bernard Cohn on the same project in '99, and it was not that kind of a project then.
Yeah, I met Bernard Cohn. Bernard Cohn was a French architect who had actually imagined the idea of developing the riverfront. And he was so upset because he said, they are building these highways along the river. How can anyone cross the road, walk to the river?
And displace a lot of people too, right?
Displace people, and also if you're doing it as a sort of to be used by people, then you have to see how are they going to approach the river. And Bernard Cohn was very upset with the fact that there were all these cars that were going to go. He said, how is a poor family going to approach the river? But personally, I tell you what I find the most saddening part is that sand going. I mean, you know, it was so distinctive of Ahmedabad. You had that sand that came from the mountains, from the Aravalis to the river bank, and now you just see this blank concrete, which, you know, open to the sun, but you know.
But it reflects to me that if I provocatively think that is there a crisis of recognition in that city? We want to be known and seen and recognized by the outside. Would that be a preposterous proposition?
No, not at all. I think that's exactly what they want. On the other hand, there's one little snippet, because I talked to someone in the mayor's office. I'm just having a casual chat with him, and I know they're all so thrilled about all these projects. You know, they feel very proud because they see Ahmedabad is becoming international. It's going to look like London or Paris and all that. But I asked him, I said, what's going to be Ahmedabad in the future? And what are you going to lose? What are you going to be in the future? He said, no, you know, what we will not lose is the masti. But actually, that unpretentiousness, which he is talking about with such relish, is exactly what is not there in a city that is so huge and developed in this way.
Yeah. And it brings back to another key theme, and sorry, I'll finish in 5 more minutes, is the forgetting Gandhi that you discuss clearly through other people's words and the fate of Vidyapeeth. Vidyapeeth was this institution established by Gandhi for, promotion of the vernacular, thinking from oneself, etc. And you say Vidyapeeth is now a dusted place, and I used to go there to get lots of books and so on.
Right.
And it's strange to see that you've used to propose that idea that, and also clear interviews that one has to forget Gandhi. Is that?
Yeah. Well, see, there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, I think, so that whole Gandhi's vernacular project, interestingly.
And peace. And non-violence. I mean, even someone suggesting Gandhi.
It's true, but I don't look at it. Okay. So Gandhi, there are two aspects. One is that you actually see that his project to, he collected, he started this, he got vernacular literature collected, cultural, old scripts, etc., and he wanted to translate them. The idea being that we should be proud of our own, right? But that sense of pride, actually, that fed into the very narrow vernacular popularization or kind of politicization in the 60s. It's odd. Gandhi was turned around, and kind of his project of creating, a sort of sense of self-esteem through this vernacular project was used by politicians in the 60s in a kind of opposite way. And Gujarat, by ousting English due to Gandhi for, let's say, well-intentioned reasons, actually then becomes a sort of source of low self-esteem, because it's a society that's moving ahead, modernizing, and doesn't know English, the language of the modernizer. So in a way, Gandhi played into that. So just because of that, I am proposing that this Forgetting Gandhi project, which is very much there right now, forget Gandhi, and
the new idea.
Recreate him as some sort of strong man who wanted to do strong things, and not the kind of complex and very much maternal figure that he was. One could see it also perhaps as a phase. It might not be the lasting one. This might now lead to something else. One doesn't know. I would like to be a bit more complex on this, because if one looks back into history, one sees things happening that they're not so simple. It's not just let's forget Gandhi, there's propaganda, let's forget Gandhi, and that's how it will be.
We'll come back kind of.
Well, I don't know.
But right now there is a conversation.
There is, definitely. There's an idea of redefining.
And you somewhere kind of also talk about how new heroes have been placed. Obviously, it's Narendra Modi, and how that connects to development consumerism. And you discuss that even in the way Modi presents himself as an image, through sartorial projects, through photographic images, and through directing specific representation of the self and so on. Is this a kind of a new hero for development consumerism? Is that
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and again to complicate this, I would say Nehru at the time when India won independence, you had the same desire to shine on the stage, and in a sense Gandhi was forgotten at that point. We chose a certain developmental path at that point, which I think in a way I also link clearly. Narendra Modi and Nehru seem opposite in terms of one is sort of socialist hero and one is a consumerist hero. But there is a link, and I would sort of suggest that the Gandhian idea of development, and Ahmedabad allows you to that way look at Gandhi with his Sabarmati ashram, to also the alternative, which was not cities, not modernization, but another form, which doesn't have to be only rural. I don't know, could be a more amorphous, maybe, but it offers that possibility. And I say yes, I mean, I agree. I think that Narendra Modi is the hero of the media age. He knows how to use the media. He uses the media very, very consciously.
So it's not just media. You were talking about that event in that Ahmedabad, that municipal building, Copy's office, where chanting nano, theatricality.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, when I say he's a hero for media age and he's using the media, I'm saying the media has also created, post-liberalization and post the explosion of the media, Indians have changed. We are different. We live on the media now. I mean, the media is so much a part of our lives, and we have not actually thought about how it's changed our expectations. So even when we look, and this is true the world over, that post Reagan, I mean, that charisma, for instance, plays a certain role, and the way the media has influenced us, and our brains have actually sort of reworked. Yeah.
But this comes a little bit different from another point that you discussed, which is the infra-saffronization of everyday institutions.
Right.
Police, a Special Justice Committee, to
Yeah.
everything. You give a wonderful list of things, local authorities,
Yeah.
so that even the people who are so-called powerful wanted to do anything cannot do anything, because it's everyday work is completely communalized or whatever. And it goes along with the other idea you propose, that the typical RSS man who is the local person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Quite different from the theatrical media politics.
Right.
So it looks to me that theatrical media politics is not for Ahmedabad, but for Ahmedabad it is that infra local person. Somewhere that you kind of mentioned that, and this goes together, in fact, in that.
Yeah, you're right. I think that local man would be Surendra Patel, the Kaka, who does all these.
Or Ashok Bhatt.
Right. Ashok Bhatt, who starts from the kitchen, back entry into people's houses. Yeah, you're right. Actually, I think Narendra Modi, that theatrical figure, would be more for the elite, to give them a foot in the sort of on the national and the international stage.
Right.
You're right. There are levels of the RSS man, but I would propose two things. One is, I think that the idea that Gujarat was a laboratory for the Hindutva project, that was already well known and talked about. So I talk about that, but I wanted to show how it is also connected with the developmental vision. That the two are not at all separate. The two very much go together. So, for instance, Ashok Bhatt, in his little local level, is also involved with the heritage, preserving the heritage project, and that heritage is in a way turning the minority into cultural artifacts.
This is kind of his revival of conservatism back again, with the heritage conservation movement.
Not necessarily, but it's sort of showcasing. So you showcase the history. You don't. The people are not part of it. You turn what was an uncomfortable history of perhaps invasion by what you see as an uncomfortable history into a showcase, into a part of tourism. And so he is involved in that developmental project. Kaka, Surendra Patel, who is very much an old style and very, very loyal RSS man, he is the one who's actually started the riverfront project. He's been involved in, and why? Because he comes from South Gujarat, where the NRI vision, I mean, he has, because a lot of the Patels went all over the world actually. They started motels in America and went to East Africa, and they have come back and brought their rural area. And so he bases his idea of international. That's where he takes his inspiration. And then you have Narendra Modi.
Right.
So there are three, but they're all part of this developmental vision.
Right. It's interesting. So there is quite a lot on connected that we don't have time, but I have two more questions to ask. One is, in fact, you mentioned earlier about how you're interested in art installations, and it is indeed very interesting for me to hear that. When I was reading the book, there were lots of installations in it, and one of that I didn't quite understand what you meant is the doll heads, the heads of a doll. There's a business a business where a woman have a huge warehouse where there is heads of dolls and people go there and collect it and do something.
Right.
What is it? I mean, so sounded a very surrealist commentary.
Yeah. So, first of all, Bombay Hotel is this place on the outskirts, which is, as I say, a kind of garbage heap, where everything, the dirt of the city gets, but it's very industrious. So they have all kinds of businesses over there. And one of the businesses is this business in doll's head. What they were doing, they take the heads, only the heads of the dolls, and then they cut them and then retrieve the eyes and the hair and all that, and then it's put into new dolls. So it's all recycled. So the business was in dolls' heads were cut, and as I said, the eyes, etc. But when you actually see it, it's surreal, because you see this heap of heads, and some have there's a Barbie doll heads, there are dolls with little chains around there. It's creepy, but it really shows you consumerism. You know, so much is created, as well as the dynamic, as well as the entrepreneurialism. It had everything in that, the ugliness of it. And oh yeah, and this business is done by old women typically, who carry this sort of loads of these dolls' head from this the warehouse is a little hut actually, a small little hut, and they carry them across for about, they walk around about 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers with these huge heaps of dolls' heads, and they sit and cut them in the sand, and then they get some really tiny amount of money each doll's head, that they probably spend 15 minutes over some 1 rupee or 2 rupees or something like that. It's inhuman in a lot.
It's interesting that, you know, that's the point we made earlier too, but there is this whole undercurrent of violence that you discuss in your book without discussing exactly whether it is doll, the way you end it with kite. Cutting is part of the book, you know, cutting it. But, and so you also have this sarcastic comment on all the pretentiousness that, you see, it's not a narrative book that does not take a position. There's a clear sarcastic comment on many pretensions. Is that the right way I can read?
I don't know if it's sarcasm as much as sadness.
Sadness.
Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe you see it as sarcasm perhaps because I don't outright say some things. I mean, I leave it to you, because if you are sensitive to something, then you will feel what I feel when I see that, right? But I don't know if it's sarcasm. Yes, I mean, there is that.
Helplessness of some kind, yeah?
Sorry?
Helplessness of some kind?
Yeah, I think it was more just sadness. Sadness because I see something going and I'm sad about. You know, there is a sense of grief.
Yeah. And the last question from me is this, that is, the strategy of the book is very interesting in the sense that you pick up people or events, but mostly people, and you discuss events, and then you leave them, and then you take the next one, and then you leave them, and then takes the next one. Sometimes they reappear, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting, and obviously that's how you could write a whole book on Ahmedabad in this 190 pages or something. But in that, there are a lot of absences, I find. And I just wanted to ask you, was it because of space or conscious, like Ella Bhatt, for instance, Haran Pandya, for instance,
right,
or Ashan Jeffrey's wife, Zakia Jeffrey, for instance, or Shankar Singh Waghela, Keshubai Patel. You see, these are key people as much as many others. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit on that.
Yeah, so first of all, as I said, I wanted to write a book about Ahmedabad that was foretelling India. So in that sense, it's not a, it's definitely a biography of Ahmedabad, it's definitely focused on Ahmedabad, but it's not telling you everything about Ahmedabad that you need to know. So I was very clear, that was, I needed to completely give voice to what I felt was significant. So I have picked, yes. But two, and very important to me, was I wanted to make people feel. And I thought if I write, because initially, as I said, there was a sociological impulse to explain, and I could very easily have written a book about why is this place violence prone, for instance, let's say. It could have been a whole book on that, talking about violence through over time. But I wanted to write a book that made people feel. And so the absences, so people, you know, sort of, before you get so invested, you know, there's a lot of journalistic books written like that about cities, which do take you in and grab you, and you kind of go into the city and all that. But I had a purpose. There was a structure to the book. There's an argument in the book. I am trying to talk about, you know, sort of social divides and violence and development. I am trying to. It's not a book that just is about people or about a city, you know. So, and I wanted to make people feel as well as think. And I don't know if I've succeeded. I feel that sometimes when I hear people's responses, it's interesting how different things are taken up by different people. But yeah, as I said, so that's hence the absences, because I feel that the structure, so hence the art installation influence, because I think that when you walk into an art installation, you are surrounded by a sensory sort of, it's affective, you know, it's not just intellectual. And I wanted that mix of affect and
and I would personally say that it has really done the job well.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Please, others from the audience will have more interesting reflections. Sorry, I took more time than I promised, but you know, that happens when you sit here.
Thank you, Amrita and Jayaraj. Now for the audience for questions. Anyone has any questions to Amrita?
Please.
When we talk about violence, now in the true sense of the word violence, it is something that we always look at being physical and something that causes harm, an understanding. But in my case, isn't development in Ahmedabad, the current idea of development carried out, the most violent of all? One is the communal violence, but I find this idea of development that our current state is carrying forward the most violent one for the country. Now it is the people, even including myself, it is this notion of development that we don't understand, that I don't understand yet what could be called development, but I feel that is the most violent one, and its effects will be, during communal violence, you can see the immediate effects in front of your eyes. So you can go forth, help, you can do things to sort of improve that condition. But this development that we are going through, everybody is seeing a different picture of what is going to be there, and I am afraid that we won't be able to, like in terms of communal violence, I find it less kind of dangerous than what the idea of development is for being put forth for the country. So what are your comments on that? Because I find development the most violent right now.
Yeah, as Jayaraj said, the violence, there's an undercurrent of violence through the book, and I'm not talking about, but let's say I'm describing things that have an inherent violence in them. So whether it's even trying to cross a road where, the sort of chaos of traffic, or I'm seeing all that as violent, the displacement of people for a project is violent, subjugation of women. There's violence all over, and certainly developmental violence. But I must point out that while I am sympathetic to the aspirations of those who want this. I am sympathetic in the sense that I understand that they desire something, and one has to pay attention to that. That's the only way, because otherwise what happens is that people who are pro-development, they're anti-development, and there is no way of coming to an understanding of any kind. So I'm not actually saying a middle path, that's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm just saying that in the book there are people who are the ones who perpetrate this developmental violence, let's say. I do hear them out. I do give voice to them. So if someone wants to, there's a man, for instance, who runs a small processing house, textile processing house, and he's just giving me a ride home, and he says, I really like it here, it's so peaceful, and soon now we will have the riverfront and we'll be looking like Paris, and he's not a violent man, he's probably a good man, a good family man, etc. And he has this dream, and he's not thinking or even aware of what it will mean to people. So I'm just saying that I have tried in the book to give voice to the aspirations, not to give voice as in build up those aspirations, so much as to try and understand how these things happen, where this kind of aspiration coexists with a certain blindness to what is actually being done in the name of that violence. So I agree with you. This is a violent vision, but I think what happens is that those who understand that need to understand why it is happening, in the sense that kind of attractiveness of that dream. If you don't understand it, you can't actually talk with it. You can't talk with those who want it. You're getting my point. I'm not saying it's not violent, I think it's extremely violent, and makes me very sad. But I also do understand that it is so attractive. Just the malls, when you see them and you describe the lights, there is a certain attractiveness to that. And if we don't see how attractive that is to a lot of people, and even to me, I would say sometimes, the glossy surfaces. Until then, we can't understand how we can become blind to what is, to the violence.
I have a question related to this, the answer that you've given. With respect to what we call modern, I mean, this was when in college when we start, understanding what is modern. So, at least when I was in first year, we were questioned what is the difference between modernity, modernism, and modernization. Now, what happened is everybody gave an answer that what it is to be modern. We did not know the difference that time when this question was asked. And now that I see in the 3 years of college and also moving across the country, I don't think a lot of people know that meaning, and I think the problem lies in this understanding of what in terms of Indian modernity, what is it, and are we getting it confused in development projects, this idea of using this idea of modernity, but it's not actually modernity that they are talking about at all. I mean, if we take Narendra Modi, if we take Hindutva and are talking about modernity, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, why? Because you're using religion, and you're using, not even religion, you're using a certain kind of an ideology to propagate, and it is the idea of modernization or progress that we see, and it is talked about as modernity. So how do we, in terms of if we talk about people understanding this kind of a concept and then putting forth their ideas of development, they will be completely different, because the way that I was confused, that we didn't know how to answer it in first year, I think a lot of people right now don't know the difference. So so these aspirations and attractiveness that you talk about, it's not actually modernity that we are thinking, it's actually modernization of some part, I feel.
But modernization is not new.
Exactly, that is what I wanted to say.
If you look at Ahmedabad and you look at how, for instance, in the late 19th century, the British, they built the railway station and everything changes, and that happened then, it's not now. That you have the old city, you suddenly have insurance companies, you have the whole kind of bunch of new commercial houses, and everything changes. The poles where the inner house used to be the most expensive and most prized, suddenly it's the one that faces the outside, the main street, that becomes expensive, right? So modernization is not new. It's not always bad either. It's also can be well intentioned. So for instance, the idea of Nehru inviting Corbusier to build Chandigarh, a modern city, was well intentioned. It's like to make a break from the past, to build an idea of a new India where we will not be superstitious perhaps, or not have communal violence. I mean, the idea could be well intentioned. Another phase, for instance, in Ahmedabad's history itself, when you actually have the city spreading to the west bank, you have a new city coming up. All these are modernization, they're not always bad. Gandhi himself, for instance, wanted sanitation in the cities. He was sympathetic to some of the modernization aspects because he thought things needed to be cleaned up, for instance, right? So even now, and that's what I'm trying to say, that just by condemning modernization, we're not going to get anywhere, because while it is extremely violent, does a lot of harm, etc., we have to be sensitive to it. We have to also understand the aspiration, or what people expect, the good things that they expect will come out of it. For instance, prosperity, which they could argue then will lead to less violence. I'm just saying all these arguments need to be taken on board. And modernity and modernization, I think modernity is when we talked about, for instance, that aesthetic aspect of cultural modernity. I think modernization has been with us for a very long time, and in this mold of a Western model, moving towards becoming a more Western sort of market-oriented society. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
I didn't have a properly framed
That's okay. So,
Yeah, so what I'm going to say is not more of a, it's more of a comment. So when we say that Modi wanted to shine on the stage, so when he does, if he wants to do that, the only thing he can do is give people what they want. Now the common man does not know that, now she said that the development is violent. It's only a bureaucrat or someone who knows about things, who has deep knowledge about that, knows that what's looking it's just bling. It's what you can see is now, it's just on this, it's just superficial. It's what's there inside. The common man doesn't know about it when he goes for even sort of developing. So that is how they define development.
who do you mean by the common man?
A man, we had a conversation, so he looked like he talking to him didn't feel like that he knows more. He has done much research on what development is.
No, so middle class man? I'm
A
just trying to
middle class,
understand. Yeah, okay.
middle class. So looking at those lights, that is what development is for him. So don't you think in a way Modi has just given what people wanted and what they will think as development, not thinking about people who actually know what development is?
No, I think that vision, and this is his vision. I don't think it's giving people what they want as much as this is his vision. And secondly, of course, to kind of, he doesn't seem to believe in the old socialist kind of model of subsidies and helping the, he seems to think he's much more, not much more, he's a market driven, which is what he's done in Gujarat, for instance, electricity and so on and so forth. He's invited the private, privatized all these public services, and that's his vision. That is his vision. Now, that vision does have components that appear very glamorous to people. And where I'm saying that I understand that people can find them glamorous, I also understand people who believe that this will actually lead to a huge spurt in growth. Okay, I have serious questions about this, but I do understand that there is a stream of, that's an argument. And yes, that common man who you say looked at the lights and sees that, he believes in this argument. Now, is this argument really borne out by facts is something that as citizens I think we really need to question, because it means a lot of money being borrowed to make these projects, for instance. It means taking land away from, it means taking public land for projects that, so we need to question all these things. We need to question the social impact. I think we need to question all that. But the very fact that there's an argument and that there's a certain vision, I understand that there is this argument and a vision, and your common man, why not? You see, that has been a dream for a lot of people, that let's live in this clean, sort of nicely laid out clean flat. I mean, that was the attractiveness that led to the modern city of Ahmedabad being built. But over the long term, it can lead to displacement, feelings of hurt or sadness or missing or grief.
So exactly. So you need to decide, either you give them what they aspire, or you, for now, you give them something which will be a problem, but in the long run, it will help them. So you have to decide between the two, in a way.
I'm saying maybe there should just be a conversation about this. I mean, so far what I think is happening is that there is on one level certain policies are being implemented and certain, and on the other hand there are people who are arguing or saying they are raising serious doubts. And I think there needs to be a conversation that is not polarizing, but a conversation that actually a conversation. And I don't know how it can take place, but I think my book attempts not so much to, but to raise things that people don't really talk about, emotions and missing,
So all through our architectural studies, we've been striving to create inclusive spaces. So God alone knows how, but we've always been striving to do that. So we've spoken of exclusive spaces in Ahmedabad, like the Sabarmati Riverfront project, for example. So have you seen any inclusive spaces that you would define as inclusive in Ahmedabad?
Absolutely.
Can you describe them?
Yeah, so Manik Chowk, for instance, it's the old marketplace in, I'm sure you know it and you've been there. So it's the old city, and very much the heart of the old city, and the old stock exchange is there, and if you go there, it's a buzzing, very lively place, right? Great food and all that. Now in the I mean, up to say the 80s or 90s, I mean, I have heard, for instance, you know, everyone used to go to Manik Chowk. So because the mills were, I mean, Ahmedabad is a city of mills, you had shifts, right? So Manik Chowk in a sense came up also. A lot of Manik Chowk's food stalls catered to the late night shift, right? So you would have workers all the time in the city. So it was safe for women in that sense, because there were always people. There were always people going to and from the mills, and then you could go to Manik Chowk and eat. But the Seth, the mill owner, would come there. The trader, you know, the guy who would actually be the salesman, who was a more middle class person, would go there. The laborer would go there, and they'd all be eating pani puri side by side. To my mind, Manik Chowk is a great example of an inclusive space. But also because Ahmedabad, as I said, was this sort of unpretentiousness was, to my mind, its hallmark, wouldn't you think? People didn't need to spend a lot of money to have fun. You know, fun was cheap, really cheap. It still is. You know, you'll go take a two-wheeler and go and eat jalebi, hot jalebis and tea, or that's the sort of fun is always like that. Have a cutting chai, or anyway, it's a dry state, of course, not very much in practice, but you know, the sources of fun are not fancy or sophisticated. They're sophisticated in a much quieter way. And so I'd say Manik Chowk, for instance, is...
Any place in the new city? Because we've always been trying to do this. I don't know if we've even defined inclusivity.
SG Highway, it can't be, but yeah, you're joking. I know, but you know, someone I know did a film. She was telling me about it. I haven't seen it, but she was telling me that. So when the malls first came up, she said that that a lot of young people would go and meet. I think she said outside the mall. So it became I guess, an inclusive space. Not inside. I think she said just outside the mall.
They go inside only for the AC.
Yeah. And someone told me, so I was doing a reading somewhere, and this Ahmedabadi came up to me and he said, you know, it's really interesting, all the malls you talk about have shut down. So I said, yeah, you know, just goes to show. I don't know, maybe another place I would say is something, for instance, like I know there are very famous chai stalls outside IIM, for instance, there's one. Then maybe, yeah, another chai stall on Ashram Road. You know, these famous chai stalls where you go and have your tea, where the salesman will come and where, well, the Seth won't come anymore, but...
So one observation here is that all of these spaces are spaces that are not built.
True.
So most of the inclusive spaces as such
Yeah.
are spaces that are not built. So would it be a wiser decision to look at what to not build
Yeah.
for an urban designer?
I would say that, I don't know what you would think, but that's,
I don't know.
you know,
I'm
the
just
riverfront.
from that perspective. Yeah.
Riverfront, the architect is Bimal Patel. Now his father, Hasmukh Patel, was involved with this group of architects at one point, where they had another, you know, over the years there have been many plans drawn up for how to develop the river. And all they wanted to do, low, minimal cost, just improve access to the river. I so wish that had happened, because it didn't cost anything. See, now the argument is that they've built up on both sides. So because they built up and spent so much money, they need to now recover the cost by building buildings, giving a lake view. So of course there are these sort of tall buildings that are going to come up, and in the images it's all with green lawns, you know, which lots of water is going to go into those lawns. The river has got water from the Narmada, which is, you know, how far away. It's filled with water now, perennially. And it's got these banks, which, as you say, you couldn't walk on. So that's a very high cost project. And then to recover that high cost, they're going to sell 25% of the land, right? Instead of that, I wish they could have left the river as it was. And as you say, so I think you're right in a sense that perhaps all you need to do is figure out how to make it more accessible, maybe there are places where you need to do some, a huge population, you need concrete. How can you support that? And he's right, which then makes you question the whole larger concept of urbanization, right? Because we are now building cities in the next 10 years. How then? You need more concrete. It's a valid argument.
So concrete is almost like a metaphor of something that is strong and stable and
Right.
unchanging, so to say, or formal, so to say.
Yeah.
Never understood why they went for concrete in Ahmedabad. You know, Corbusier, of course, was building, but the worst material to use in 45 degrees, the reinforced concrete has steel inside. The heat is not materials, and that's the nature of the heat transfer. And concrete, in that sense, was one of the worst materials to actually think of. But obviously, Corbusier aesthetics is something very
Right.
different, and we liked it, and that was the idea of modernity. So, you know, we went for it, and eventually, Bhima changed completely.
Yes.
The concrete was completely visible. After India, he did AMA, from AMA High Court,
Yeah.
from High Court,
Yeah.
and then the riverfront. I mean, there's a complete shift to grey concrete
Which he explains.
because you need
He
them.
explains. He says
Styles,
he's
or
so,
his teachers.
you know,
you know.
he talks. He says it all. So yeah, you know, he's very proud. He driving impulse, and I think that's also the driving impulse right now, which Ahmedabad seems to be kind of showcase. You know, it sort of, you see it very visibly there. Let's do things. At least I wrote a piece. I'm sorry, I wrote a piece about the Kakaria development. I don't know if you've seen the lakefront development, but they've taken this lakefront and built walls around it and all that. And I wrote about this again in this sort of similar sort of presenting it as a conflict of two ways of thinking. And someone wrote a response to this. Madam, be grateful, at least they are doing something. You know, so the idea is let things be done.
There is this one place, I don't know if you came across it, since we're talking about social divide and everything. So there is a place called Ram Rahim No Tekro. I don't exactly remember which
It's on the
area it is
riverfront,
in.
I think.
No, it's I don't exactly remember where it is. It is designed by this architect called Hiren Patel.
Yeah.
So it is a very small space, maybe just double of this room. It has a mosque in it. It has a temple just beside the mosque, and it has a school. So there is a school, a temple, and a mosque in this small area, and that is a place that has really, I mean, it characterizes the entire area, and there are Muslims and Hindus. There are Muslims who go to the mosque. There are Hindus who go to the temple, and it's right beside one another. It almost shares a wall, and there is a huge tree in the middle. So somehow I found that to be and it gives a very, you feel very comfortable in that space somehow. So I found that to be one of the most inclusive spaces that I have been to in Ahmedabad. So I'd just like to end with that.
Yeah, I haven't been to the Tekro itself, but some people did tell me they are from Ram Rahim, and they said they are going to be displaced by the riverfront. So I'm not sure about it, but that's what I heard.
Okay. It's very interesting to reflect back on concrete. That's very interesting in the sense that this is the worst material to use in Ahmedabad, and how through Corbusier it has become, or in the first intervention by modernist architects, become one of the popular material. All the modernist architects in Ahmedabad, from Doshi to Ashmi, Doshi's first building, that Institute of Indology, is a concrete jungle. You can't even stand on it. It's just so heat coming out of it, you know. And from then on, concrete has become this hugely important material, and it just moved from Ahmedabad to the rest of the country, everywhere else. And it in some ways seems to be reflecting something that you were also saying earlier, that how that we have in development projects we manage to exclude ourselves. It's all about inhumanity of it, you know. It's something that is not friendly, non-human. There is some kind of a practice that seems to be propagating with, which is symbolic from this material itself, right?
Right, but it sort of seems to symbolize some aspirations. You know, the idea of the mall. For instance, the thing I saw everywhere, the blue, red and yellow of the mall, it upset me so much. But that's what signifies a dream come true, you know. and that's, so I don't know, I mean, just hopefully I wonder if it's a phase, I wonder. I mean, I'd like to think that maybe that's also a possibility, you know, that, but just a question about Corbusier, the Atma building, for instance, it's concrete, but the way the river and the air comes in, isn't there a certain aesthetic to it that allows, I don't know because I'm not an architect, that use of throwing concrete?
Which it had to be ventilated, but yeah.
Oh.
Artificially ventilated.
I see.
Anyone else? Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Link that and somehow.
Bureaucrat who so you know, for him it is upward mobility, but right, it's a end for him and a signifier of that mobility, but of course it's that particular space of capital, of a very sort of fairly bleak, no one lives, you know, very few, only bureaucrats seem to live there, and very laid out, very kind of planned city. So that's one. Two, in the sense there's a sort of, so I tried to hint at the Nehruvian project of modernity, or I don't know, combine modernity and modernization over there, I guess, by asking for a planned city. And Gandhinagar was supposed to be built by Khan, I think. I mean, they had some discussions with Louis Khan, and then that didn't work out. So they had Kanvinde, not Kanvinde and Rai, or I forget who the, sorry, not Kanvinde.
Someone starts name M-A-W.
Yeah, but they are, I think they were with Corbusier, so there is a Corbusierian pathway there. But the idea, of course, is let's make a planned, it was a planned city. So I don't go into it in depth, but there is that hint of, because I want to give a perspective to the current thrust of development. It's not happening in a vacuum, and it would be incorrect to only focus on this without understanding the trajectory. So there is a trajectory, and there was a project that
planned cities. Another would be to talk about what are
I think if one started bringing that, just as smart cities has become this sort of phrase that everyone just throws around and bandies, if you could make just cities into that kind of phrase, first of all, start kind of make that the thing. Two, the danger is, as you said, I mean, suppose the state could be the state money on smart cities, or you know, infrastructural projects and so on and so forth. Now, there is clearly a sort of power goes with that sort of money that corporate houses will make, or that the political corporate connect. So there is that problem, right? I mean, but if citizens start talking about just cities or about their needs from cities, versus just the image where the common man is glamour struck by, right? Not just the lights, but let's say he wants affordable housing, affordable food, those, affordable health, and starts actually investigating. Because when you actually see what will happen if a hospital that was at one point subsidized, suppose it starts catering to the NRI and starts only become, I mean, how will it affect you? All these policies, how will they affect you? Once that starts getting talked about, that's important. I mean, that could be one way of changing the conversation, right? The danger is that the state as a facilitator could still pay lip service. So one example would be, for instance, there's a lot of talk about, if you want to build an inclusive public space, which is what the riverfront project is now being talked about as, then we can question. Let's say you want to just include a just space, right? A just public space. Then how much need it cost? Does it need to cost so much? If the end is X, then do we need to go around like this, or can we come here straight? I mean, these are questions that need to be now sort of asked, because the state as a facilitator is a great idea, but why